So welcome back everybody, and our third of the three case studies is on online youth safety. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, who is Triona Quill. Triona is an Assistant Secretary in the Department of Culture, Communications and Sport, and she heads up the Broadcasting and Media Division. So you're very welcome, Triona.
Thanks, Martin. So, good afternoon, everyone. And I suppose, just to bring you back a little bit, I got involved in this area for the first time in 2017 when I applied to move across to departments and join the Broadcasting and Media Division, which at that stage only dealt with RTE and TG Ceathair and radio, so no problems there. But in 2018, there was a European directive called the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, which previously had dealt just with broadcasting, but for the first time was dealing with streaming services, but also what they termed video sharing platforms, and introduced the concept of trying to do something in terms of the protection of children in the first instance, and also illegal content online. And so that's how online safety emerged into my area. And if you think about it, you know, if you were talking about having responsibility for safety across the whole of government, you'd say it was very wide and kind of fuzzy brief, you know, from everything from safety at work to the safety of children's toys. But like, that's the reality of the online world now. It encompasses everything. So trying to grasp what online safety is from our perspective, and in lots of ways from a policy perspective, it's everything that other departments don't want to do falls into online safety, that brief to some extent. And just to give you an idea of the ecosystem, and this is a subset of it, but starting from the left, the European Commission is a key player in all of this, because a lot of the legislation, regulations, and so on that impact on online safety originate at European level. So, you know, the policy job starts with trying to influence the European Commission, work together with like-minded member states in terms of framing policy positions, and then ultimately, when a proposal comes through, build alliances in terms of negotiations. And, you know, when we entered the area back in 2018, I mean, the only thing really here that was in place was GDPR, and that had just come on stream. Then you flow over, and there's a variety of government departments also involved in the space. And then over on the right-hand side, in terms of implementation, it's mainly by digital regulators, of which there's a network at this stage. So it's quite a complex environment. You also have the likes of the Guards hotline and so on involved. So there's a lot to work through there, even in terms of internal stakeholders, in terms of making progress on online safety. The Audiovisual Media Service Directive that I mentioned was pretty vague on what it wanted to be done. I mean, it did mention protection of under-18s from pornography and gratuitous violence, but it made a very broad policy statement then about protecting minors from content that might impair their physical, mental, or moral development. And so a key part of our job was to try and translate that into something meaningful, and also something that the legislators could work with, and the drafters of legislation. So I suppose our first step in moving to considering this was just looking through some of the key aspects framing the work. One was that because of what's called country of origin, what we did would be done for the whole of Europe, because most of the platforms are based here. So for any platforms like Google or Meta or TikTok or whatever, what Ireland did would matter for the whole of Europe in the way that it does for the DPC in relation to GDPR. We were under a lot of time pressure because I suppose the European Commission initiates infringement proceedings if you're not implementing its directives or regulations in time. And that came to be quite an issue because in the middle of trying to implement this, we had the 2020 election called, and then a gap of a number of months for the formation of a government, and then another gap for the formation of Oireachtas committees who could consider draft legislation. So all of those added up to considerable time pressures. In considering what we would do around deciding what, physical, mental and moral protections for children would involve, we decided to define particular categories of harmful content that wouldn't be exhaustive, and to include a mechanism in the legislation that would allow for those categories to be added to over time. Looking back now in hindsight, I think one of the challenges is that there was very much a focus on content at that time. In more recent times, it's really around the design of online platforms that a lot of attention is falling, because that brings in issues around recommender systems and so on, which is very much a current focus. But back then, the focus was not only on content, but was on individual pieces of content. So the only other regulator internationally dealing with the regulation of content was in Australia. And they didn't have an overall framework. What they had was a mechanism for individual pieces of content to be complained about and possibly taken down with regulatory oversight if the process didn't work to satisfaction. And I suppose what we felt was, looking at the evidence, that would never work at scale, because if you're trying to deal with individual pieces of content takedown across Europe, and if that was the only mechanism that you had for trying to embed online safety for children, you would be faced with probably a regulator being flooded and essentially unable to act. So we looked instead at trying to put in place systemic measures using categories of content like cyberbullying and pro-anorexia material, self-harm and pro-suicide material as key aspects that could be dealt with. As I said, there weren't international comparators, but we did have some bodies of evidence to work from, including a very good Law Reform Commission report from 2016 that looked at digital, I think it was digital safety and harmful communications. And we looked at, I suppose, other aspects like private members' bills coming forward through the Oireachtas. We engaged with children's rights groups, with industry, with public consultation and so on. But, I think one thing I just want to draw attention to as well is, and it hasn't come up a huge amount, John McKeown touched on it, but ministerial leadership is really important in this area, because particularly in trying to frame policy proposals that a minister can work with, you need to know something about where in the triangle around, legitimacy versus data and evidence that person lies, and what they'll be most persuaded by. I was lucky that, I don't know if he's still here or not, Richard Bruton was my minister at the time, by coincidence, but he was very interested in policy, and we decided to tackle the directive through a series of policy papers, putting options and gathering as much evidence as we could. But Richard Bruton was, I think, having an experienced minister that knew the ropes and knew how to lead things through difficult and sometimes, quite fraught discussions around child safety, I think was very helpful. We did public consultation, but we also did an open policy debate, which I don't hear as much about anymore, but I think was very good at the time in terms of getting diverse people together to hear each other's opinions. And I think, interestingly, the most coherent and thoughtful contributors to that were probably teenagers. who were WebWise ambassadors for online safety in their schools, who took a really balanced and measured and nuanced approach to a lot of the questions that arose. And I'll come back to the role of young people in this debate. We did also try and work with the Australian e-safety commissioner and some UK children's rights advocates in looking at some aspects like, how could we integrate some element of an individual complaints process within the legislation without tipping that balance of systemic regulation as well? And that was also very helpful. I mean, a key part of it from our perspective was like none of this would be of any use unless you had an effective regulator to implement it. And so we spent quite a lot of time in looking at that aspect as well. I mean, it's interesting that we've a lot of regulators and even digital regulators at this stage. They nearly all have different structures and regulatory powers. Sometimes dealing with quite similar areas. Again, the Law Reform Commission did a 2018 report on regulatory powers, which was quite a useful starting point from our perspective. But we had to look in the first instance at what we had in regulatory terms. And it was the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland was our starting point. Would we still needed a broadcasting regulator? Would we leave that in situ as it was and set up a separate digital regulator, or would we try and have a single regulator dealing with a number of functions? And I suppose we were conscious in that regard of, the increasing extent to which digital platforms had fingers in lots of different pies. And so it seemed to us there were benefits in having a single regulator looking at content overall, because, broadcasting and streaming is, has almost become a single entity at this stage, but also between online platforms generally and streaming content, YouTube, etc. It's all a single whole at this point in lots of respects. But again, there are a very large number of different models out there. And I suppose sometimes it seems that the Irish system is generating different approaches, which is fine, I think, if it's done in a thoughtful way with regard to what's already there and approaches that are seen to have worked or are seen to have problems. But I'm not sure that's always the case. As we were building the legislation to implement the directive, we also had to think about, engaging with deeper, getting sanctioned for a new regulator, deciding on its remit, looking at where digital regulation might go so that there would be scope to expand it in the future as more regulations came online, and what we could do to give it teeth. So, I mean, administrative sanctions are taken for granted now, I think, but we quite a battle to get that through the Attorney General's office because penalties weren't referenced in the European directive that we were working with. In the meantime, then, we had COVID. So the directive was signed off in October 2018. Then we had a new government in 2020. Myself and my team ended up moving departments. We got a new minister. And to some extent, we had to begin again in socialising some of the approach. But the outcome there was the Online Safety and Media Regulation Act 2022, which is what set up Commission Naman, defined categories of harmful content and a framework for developing online safety codes, as well as media codes for the rest of the media sector, and put in place meaningful penalties. In the meantime, then, and just to go back to this slide again, I suppose what had happened was all of this had started to come on stream. So in particular, I suppose the Digital Services Act was very important. So Commission Naman was also assigned responsibility for that. but it kind of encompasses a lot of what dealing with European regulation is about, because it's not just that it's a single harmonised approach across Europe. It effectively puts a block on national initiatives in relation to anything that comes within that European remit. So if you take something like recommender systems, they're dealt with under the DSA. It's very difficult then at national level to do anything additional that impact on recommender systems, because the DSA is maximum harmonisation. Maybe not impossible, but very tricky, and has to be cleared at European level, and so on. We also had the challenge that the DSA, which was initiated after the AVMSD, got signed off before we had implemented our legislation. So in the meantime, it had come on stream with some areas that overlapped. And there are still kind of areas where it's not entirely clear where the boundaries lie at times. We're now at a phase where, during Ireland's forthcoming presidency of the EU, the AVMS is being revised. Essentially, a review has been taking place, and the Commission is expected to come forward with proposals sometime in the autumn. So I think a key element of that will likely be, certainly the discussion will be around the issue of whether under 16s, social media is banned in respect of under 16s. It's not clear yet whether AVMS will be the vehicle for that if it's agreed. It could be some other legislative initiatives that are coming forward. And the DSA itself will be reviewed next year as well. So there's a continuing flurry of regulation and legislation, which in itself is trying to catch up and never quite succeeding with some of the harms that are, that citizens and particularly young people are encountering online. And in the meantime, I suppose there is an attempt to come to grips with, trying to get ahead of some of those aspects as well. In respect of the digital age of majority, I suppose what I'd say is we're watching the space closely. There's very disputed evidence at this stage as to, whether it's the solution or a key part of the solution for keeping children safe online. In the UK, University of Cambridge has done some research that has fed into the UK government's perspective, and it's expected to make a decision in July, I think. But I suppose in summary, what it found was, there is limited evidence to date that a complete ban will make a significant impact for the, positively for young people's well-being online. However, it does find that some restrictions might yield benefits, whether those be in terms of time or in scope or some other initiatives. On the other hand, France, which has also conducted research, and sometimes it depends on the balance of public health expertise versus other expertise that's involved in the research. France has found that they've a very strong evidence base for bringing in a ban, and they're proposing under 15s. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has set up an expert group that's going to be reporting in July, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that. But in the meantime, at political level, I think the idea of a ban has kind of caught fire across Europe among politicians. It's very popular among parents, and surveys consistently across Europe have found that. So to some extent, our job is to build an evidence base in the face of some very convinced people across Europe that this is the solution. And I'm not saying whether it is the solution or not, because we need to see where some of that work brings us. But there is very contested evidence out there. We've looked, obviously, the Online Health Task Force that reported a number of months ago feeds into all of this, as well as does the Oireachtas Committee on the Media recently published a report where, again, they found that other measures in their view, would be more effective. On the looking at the possibility that a ban may be put in place, but regardless of that, the fact that pornography is still an issue in terms of young people being able to access it online. We're working with the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform on including age verification within the new government digital wallet that's being developed. And this is an initiative that I suppose will use MyGovID data on the basis of consent by the individual involved, but their personal information won't be shared with the platforms. So I suppose it's a way of addressing some of the privacy concerns that have been articulated. But it would be foolish to think that that will overcome all issues with implementation, be it for under 18s in relation to pornography, or under 16s or any other age in relation to any restrictions. Like, there are always going to be challenges. It will help mitigate some of the issues, but it won't address all of the problems, because any of us who are parents know that kids are incredibly resourceful when it comes to outwitting both their parents and general systems that are put in place. But in the meantime, I suppose, looking at the issue of legitimacy, I think our next step is going to be to talk to young people themselves. So we've set up a youth forum for next week, which will focus on kids aged 10 to 17, different age groups, and putting some questions to them around what they think solutions should be, what will keep them safe, and what they think shouldn't be done, in essence. And finally, I suppose, and I'll have to reduce this a bit, I'm conscious of time here, but in terms, I mean, look, communications always comes up in these. I suppose one of the things I learned in the course of the process was about communications. You start off thinking communications is about telling people lots of things, and a penny gradually drops that, you have to listen a bit as well. And I suppose one of the things that we did find very useful was building alliances with people. I mean, with NGOs, with lots of others across the landscape. Not that people will agree on everything, but there will be aspects that they will agree with you about. And they're far better proponents of that position than you can be, because it gains a level of credibility, with media and with others, that can be incredibly useful in trying to build consensus. And that's something that, we've really found good. We've tried to sort of work as well with the Oireachtas committees, because even if, there's the political dimension, it's always live. Meeting committee members one-to-one at times can help diffuse some of the confusion that arises in relation to all that's being brought forward, and I suppose was very helpful to us. In terms of the role of data and evidence, it's really difficult in a fast-moving environment, because you've started looking at one thing and something else comes online. So it is challenging in that environment to say that you have a very coherent and definitive data set that you can use, but nevertheless it plays an incredibly important role. I mentioned regulators in terms of effectiveness of implementation. I would say that that's an ongoing job of work. It's not just about setting up a regulator and getting at the staff. Like, we meet them every fortnight to try and, I suppose, strengthen that feedback loop about how in practice they're implementing and what needs to be changed in terms of legislation or other approaches. And I suppose finally I would just say managing morale is an important issue, because you've small teams involved in all of these initiatives. At times you open a newspaper and people can feel like everything they're doing is wrong or not recognised or being misinterpreted. And over a period of years that it takes from initiating legislation to getting it over the line, that's a very long time for people to feel like they're not delivering effectively enough. So I think that's always something that needs to be considered in both policy and implementation. So I'll stop there. Sorry for going over time, Brendan.